Hello, and thank you for joining us for an episode of Healthy Soils for Sustainable Cotton webinar series. Joining us today is Dr. Jason Schmidt, an assistant professor in the Department of Entomology at the University of Georgia. Dr. Schmidt is the research laboratory director for the Schmidt Biocontrol Lab and provides outreach for UGA Cooperative Extension. Over the years, Dr. Schmidt has partnered with growers of soybeans, corn, squash, blueberries, cotton, peanuts, and now onions to bring new understanding of natural pest control. He helps facilitate reduction in pesticide use and increases thoughtful consideration for land use and land configuration. His research focuses on conservation biological control, where he combines field monitoring of beneficial insects and spiders and pests with molecular techniques to understand the functioning of agricultural food webs. One of his most recent projects focused on biodiversity benefits of cover cropping in cotton. We invited Dr. Schmidt to discuss some of his work and the broad picture of biodiversity provisioning for agriculture. In this webinar episode, Dr. Schmidt will talk about ecological pest management. He will discuss biodiversity and then focus on cover crops as a tool for natural pest management in cotton for insects and weeds. Dr. Schmidt, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here today, and as she said, I'm down here. I'm at the University of Georgia. I'm on the Tifton campus of University of Georgia, and today I'm going to talk about primarily biodiversity within agricultural systems. And what I mean by biodiversity is two components. One is the biological, so that is anything living, plants, animals, microbes, fungi. And then the other piece of that is that there should be a diversity of these types performing multiple roles for agriculture. A second piece of this puzzle is that conservation of land in agricultural landscapes is important to maintain that biodiversity that function for us. So two main take-homes from my talk today will be that really the future of food and fiber production is dependent on biodiversity. And two, a key element of that conservation and maintenance of biodiversity is habitat conservation, which can help restore and maintain biodiversity that is essential to our production of food. And I'm going to begin this story with a little bit of information that has been put together through scientists around the world, and it starts a little doom and gloom, but it has a positive ending with some hope. And that is that scientists around the world have found that human driven decline in life in multiple different types of animals and plants around the world. Some of the extinction risks and loss of diversity extends to many plants and animals. Some of the proportions, if you look at this red area of each of the different taxonomic groups here, that is the proportion that is sort of at risk for decline. And these proportions can be quite large in all areas of the globe, from terrestrial, freshwater, and marine. And specifically, some groups that are definitely of concern would be this recent paper on the bird decline. And around the United States, so this hits home for many of us, and that is around the United States, over the last number of years, since 1970, there's been a recognized decline in the billions of birds that we would observe in our landscapes. And the problem with this is, if you look at this little pie graph over here, a few of them, these birds are quite diverse, and that diversity of birds then provides different types of functions to the ecologies of our nation and also around the world. So losing that diversity likely has impacts on other ways in which our systems function, including food and fiber. Another big group, and a lot of times we think about insects as being a problem, but the diversity of many of the insects are actually quite good. Most of the insects are not pests at all. And this paper here brought together information from researchers around the world on what taxa of insects tend to be declining, and then which types are declining. And so what they found from putting all this data together, and you can see we have the United States, we have Brazil, we have countries all around Europe. And what they found from this report is a number of significant drivers of decline in species. And one of the big ones that's recognizable on this graph here is that habitat change, that is the conversion from a natural, connected type landscape to fragmented, and then mostly in agriculture or a human type landscape, contributes the largest amount to the decline of multiple types of insect taxa. Then the other ones here, pollution, which is a broad term, and that would include insecticides and other pesticides, biological traits, the type of organism that's out there, and then also climate change. There's a change in the variability in the weather also influences these taxa. But the big one here, which we have some control over in terms of our management, would be the land. And this actually goes back to quite an old quote by Teddy Roosevelt when he looked out at Yosemite. And land use and land planning is critical, and we have control over this. We are able to control our landscapes a bit when we go through habitat conversion to potentially leave in some habitat that helps with maintenance of biodiversity, and also add where we're lacking. So is biodiversity loss important? I would say it definitely is. This is now very constant discussion in many folks around the world, and I think it's very important for growers of our fields as well, and it's something that all of us have to think about. Mostly I'm focused on insects, and so there are quite a few different insects. You know, one group in this biodiversity scheme that we've heard a lot about recently, you can probably pick out from this figure. And these types of organisms provide pollination equal to billions alone in the United States for our crops. And that is, of course, bees. But bees are not the only pollinator out there. There's quite a diversity of different pollinators. And I'll tell you one little story that came out recently in Texas, and that is even in cotton, pollinator abundance and increasing pollinator abundance in this landscape is linked to increase in production of cotton. So maintaining areas in the landscape that does provide flower resources for pollinators will benefit cotton producers. And here's how they presented a piece of that. So this study was in Texas by Cruiser et al. And what these two figures represent is this would be the amount of local natural land within an agricultural landscape, and then this would be the pollinator abundance. So if there's more of that natural local land mixed into the landscape, that corresponds with greater amount of pollinators. Now, that only matters if we get something back from it. And what they found was that as we increase then the pollinator abundance, we reduce the limitation of pollen that's received by those different cotton flowers. So that means increased pollination, increased boll production. So that's a positive thing. Another one that I'm quite interested in that you can pick out of this graph, and typically the one at the top there being ladybugs, is one that everybody kind of knows about. These really active, voracious predators that enjoy eating aphids a lot, but they also eat other things. There are other of these natural enemies, these naturally occurring predators that are out there that live on the ground too. This is an example of a tiger beetle, quite a beautiful one. If you see these, they run around on the ground, and if you disturb them, they jump and they'll fly a little ways and land. very active and fast ground-dwelling type of predators. And there are a lot of pests that move between the ground and up in the canopy. So having both can be quite important. Now, an area that I don't really study, but is also important on the biodiversity, and I think in this series someone covers aspects of this, but in the soil itself, there are a diversity of different microbes and fungi that are really unexplored, and how all of this activity contributes to the quality of production and the quality of those plants. And I'm sure that in the next years with all of our molecular tools will be something that will be better resolved. But having that biodiversity is also important. But in terms of insects, I would almost venture to say that insects built this city. They are important for the maintenance of our crops and our fiber. So I would say yes, biodiversity loss is important. I think loss of natural functions provided by biodiversity is one of our modern crises that we will have to target to continue to produce sustainable fiber and food. Now, the positive side of that is that, so I've said that it's important, and I've said that it does, biodiversity does contribute to these services that humans depend on. So I should probably provide a little bit of more global data to support that. So some researchers have also brought together data from around the world to understand the drivers of biodiversity loss. They're also looking at, well, what kinds of things does biodiversity do? And the results are quite clear. And what we can see here is in this graph. So again, this is from around the world, and they measure two items that they put together in this paper, and one of them will be represented on the left here, and this would be pollinators, and then one on the right here would be natural enemies. So what this is on each of these axes is the correlation between having diverse pollinator communities within the landscape, or having diverse natural enemy communities within the landscape, and how that corresponds with pollination. So the service that is needed for a pollination dependent crop. And the second one is pest control. And both of them are strongly positive. That is, when we get more diversity in types of pollinators in the landscape, that corresponds with pollination. And the second one is that we get greater pest control services by promoting biodiversity out there. And another way that they then explored this data was then to look back, and this relates to the habitat question from before that I provided global data on from other researchers, and ask questions about what about the landscape might be contributing to this. So this diagram is a nice way to put together quite a few different types of variables and look at the interrelatedness between those variables. So on this one, I'm showing at the top here, this is the richness of pollinators, and then how that relates to landscape simplification. So when we take a landscape that is very connected, has lots of different types of plants in the landscape, to a landscape that only has one or a few, that would be landscape simplification. Then the other one here is key is pollination. So how does landscape simplification then influence richness of pollinators? And so we can see that there's a few, these arrows represent different things about this. So if it's red, it indicates kind of a negative relationship. So when we simplify the landscape to certain degrees, that has a negative impact on pollinator richness. Now that's a problem, because if you look on the other side of here, pollinator richness has a positive effect on pollination. And the key one there then, so what if we get positive pollination? What we want then out of that is that positive pollination service from the richness corresponds with production. And this value here with the black arrow indicates that what they found from putting all of these studies together from around the world is that by increasing pollinator richness through things like improving the landscape, will generate higher amounts of pollination and therefore greater production. So that's a positive. And we can ask the same question then of the natural enemies. So I replaced these two then, or they did in this paper. This is richness now of different natural enemies of pests. This is now pest control, and the same sort of question here all the way through. And the same answer comes out, that is, with greater richness and things to improve that richness will increase pest control and crop production. So that is a positive. Yes, biodiversity is important. By promoting biodiversity, this also promotes ecosystem services that we depend on, at least pollination and crop pest management, but likely many others that we haven't even measured right now. So the question then is, what are some things that researchers are talking about, and NRCS and others are talking about, that we can do to promote biodiversity in our landscapes and in our production systems? And so I'm going to begin at a very broad scale, and then I'm going to go down, and when we get close to the within field scale, that's where I'll talk more specifically about some of the work that I'm working on. So if we look at the really broad scale, now these are obviously really different looking agricultural systems, but if we look on the top here, this would be a system that is pretty homogeneous within here. You can see that there's a crop that's growing. This crop is broken up so that we have driveways, but there isn't any other types of habitat within the cropping landscape. There are things on the edge. Now this is an example of a landscape that has some hedgerows in here. It's got some other complexity, and it's not just all one type of habitat. You can see that there's multiple types of cover. So this would be quite a bit more complex, allowing for more areas for things to live and to promote biodiversity. Now, in saying that, one of the conversations that comes up about creating landscape complexity is, well, we still need to be able to get farm equipment through here. We need to be able to have that be efficient, and that's absolutely true. And we build that into the designs of our projects as well. This, by creating diversity in here, doesn't mean make it less efficient. It means that there's a trade-off there in allowing some habitat to be there, but also that it works within the framework of managing the fields for production. And that can be done through hedgerows, through allowing areas that aren't very productive to just become other habitat. So there are opportunities there that don't get in the way of production. But complexity is good. And one other aspect of that complexity is that areas within that landscape then are kind of connected, so that there are ways for that either wildlife, and some growers actually just grow these native areas to promote deer and other things like that. Where you're promoting deer, you're likely promoting pest management services and pollinators as well, because that's natural habitat. For very large habitat provision, there has to be very large bridges, so that these areas of very high quality green, all year round production of floral resources and things for others to eat in homes have to be connected in a way so the animals can move around, and there are opportunities for that. So one opportunity for that is, and especially down here in the southeast, and this is just a picture of Georgia, and I pulled out a picture that has the waterways, and in many areas of the southeast, we're living in basically an old wetland area, and these wetlands then are connected by all these waterways and tributaries. And along those tributaries, those tributaries allow water to move around the landscape as it should. And what the NRCS has put out is some kind of guiding principles for how to manage land around those. So for instance, if this is just one of their pictures from NRCS, but kind of a rule of thumb would be allow 35 feet buffer between that water area, like a tributary or a lake, or even of about 35 feet. So 35 feet around those allows for that area to be used for just natural growing of other types of plants that would fuel the landscape. And it buffers the edge of the field, which would likely be over here in production, and filters any water that then would come down into the waterway and be moved across. So those buffers are an opportunity and an essential one. And those buffers could be filled with things like perennial wildflower habitats. And this has been a big conversation right now about how to do this and how to do it right and how to do it effectively. But using maintaining some sort of permanent habitat that is perennial, that seeds, it may require a little bit of maintenance, but they become lower maintenance with time, are ways to do that. And here's a few pictures of what that might look like. Here's another concept within that same area, and that is allow some areas to be perennial. They would have grasses and mixes of things, and they not only have benefits for that, for the animals that I talk about, like the insects and pollinators, but also as a means to reduce wind so that soil doesn't just blow away. And that was quite a big conversation quite a while ago, and not as big a one right now, but that can be broken up in that way. Another term for these that folks have called them is beetle banks, allowing some habitat for beetles and other natural enemies to be in here, and then they can disperse and spill over into the agricultural land to provide ecosystem services. So there's a few concepts to look at them again, and this really leads into where some of the questions that we're working on and some of the concepts that we're playing with right now. So here's a little picture of my lab last summer and some different activities going on. We do some monitoring. So a student of mine was doing some monitoring with drones and looking at predicting pollinator abundance based on amount of floral area with a drone. We also, on the right here, we're growing a lot of different native flowering perennials and annuals in these little tiny microplots. So each one of those little plots that you see here is a species of native to the southeast. We grow them and see how they behave, at least in our soils. And what I'll show you is that they behave differently depending on soils, but you can get them to grow. You can also see that just from this picture alone, that they're not going to be all the same, and these different plants will not be able to be used in all the same types of environments. So they provide different types of services. The other one is that we've played a little bit with putting border plots along different agricultural areas, and that's a growing area right now that we're partnering with folks on. So we'll have to see how that turns out. So planning for diversity in our landscape can be a matter of planting different mixtures or different types of native flowers. And what you can see here is that over a couple of years, I think we've been playing around with this material now since 2016, so I'm relatively new to it. I'm not a horticulturalist, but I can grow these plants, and I even abuse them a lot, and they tend to grow pretty easy. A horticultural colleague who works with this on me gives me a hard time. Her plots are always gorgeous, but I grow them, and they grow with pretty low maintenance. I sometimes starve them of water. I don't even look at them, and then I go out and they're still flowering, and I send my colleague an email that says, "Ha, see, they still work." We take a lot of observations within these different plots, and right now that is from insects. You can see a variety of different insects in here: parasitoids, spiders, and yes, aphids. A lot of aphids grow on some of them, but any of the aphids that we've seen are ones that would grow on milkweeds, and these are not pests. These are, now if you were a horticulturalist and you wanted that milkweed to look clean of aphids, then yeah, it's not something that you like. But for me, this is growing natural enemies. You can even see some predators on here that are generalists, being skimness, and then you can also see that there's some parasitoids that are having activity. So it's food. I look at those aphids as food for natural enemies in the landscape. So we started this project, and we have two sites right now that have quite a bit different features there, as you can see from this EPA ecoregions map. I'm down here in Tifton, which is the coastal plain. Our soils tend to be a lot sandier, loamy, and up here near the Atlanta area in Griffin, which is the other side, these soils tend to be a lot more with clay. So pretty different environments. So we've grown a whole bunch of them, and I'm just going to show you some pretty pictures on them and talk a bit about a few of the species that we see. And I'm gonna categorize them into kind of top planters or top bloomers in terms of what to plant. So there's been a continued conversation on what to do about these monarchs and maintaining that type of diversity. Well, some of the things we can do, like planting these couple of milkweeds that you see on the top of this list here, Asclepias tuberosa and Asclepias incarnata. These both are good performers. They will definitely attract monarchs. If you see the larvae on them, you'll basically see little caterpillars. They'll be chewing that plant down, so expect to have that plant chewed down. But they also have a lot of other pollinators that occur on them. We have a variety of other plants, a really nice low-growing plant that is very easy to kind of get established and have it spread out to cover the ground is this helenium. And there's a few helenium out there. One that gets the news a lot are any of these coreopsis, and those tend to do quite well in those soils up there. And Tifton, this is 2018, one plant that I found to be quite a winner down here was a Salvia coccinea. This is a scarlet sage. And this one just bloomed and bloomed and bloomed. It's a gorgeous plant with red flowers, long corolla, gorgeous, tons of stuff on it. And my other favorite one that did a lot of blooming and it produced a very large, kind of bushy plant with white flowers all over it was this frost aster. Those two are quite good. And again, this yellow sneezeweed or helenium, those heleniums did well. Probably everyone's probably heard about black-eyed Susan. This is an easy one to grow. One interesting thing though is I have seen quite a few fire ant mounds, and I'm kind of interested to see if they have some type of relationship because they seem to build their nests right on top of a mound of Rudbeckia. So that's kind of interesting. So we looked at these plants in terms of how long they bloomed, when they bloomed, how much bloom they had, things of that nature. And then we also measured insect abundance on them, and we focused on two groups for now. We have the rest of them in there, but I'm just going to show up a little bit of data on that. And so similar to the production of flowers, if you look here, I just ranked these flowers here by how many natural enemies we saw in there, so predators and parasitoids, and then by amount of pollinators. And they basically correlate there. You can see at this Griffin site that the purple bar here represents pollinators, and that is very high. And this Asclepias tuberosa, the milkweed, this one was certainly a winner for pollinators. And that wasn't just monarchs. These are bees and wasps and other pollinators as well. The natural enemies are quite low. And I'm going to show you Tifton here. Tifton, if you see the same color for each of those bars, the top flowers are a little bit different here, but all similar ones kind of show up on here. But one strong difference between the two sites, and may have led to what we have here for our data, is that the Griffin site has been set up as a landscape and kind of home grower place to get outreach on ornamentals and how to integrate those ornamentals in landscapes. So there's a ton of different types of turf there. There's flowering trees. So there's a diversity of different plants on that site, and the site is also bordered by forests. And at the Tifton site, where I have my plots, these plots of wildflowers are sitting basically right adjacent to a whole bunch of experimental agricultural commodities. So there have been tomatoes, peppers, eggplant. I've even seen folks grow tobacco there. There's squash, a variety of different agricultural commodities. And what you see here is probably one of the reasons why there's a lot of natural enemies already kind of in that environment, and we're promoting those more so than pollinators. And there really isn't any other flowering habitat within that environment except for pollinators. Now, I'm pretty sure that this pattern changed, and in the next year we were able to find a lot more pollinators, so we're probably building the pollinator populations in that landscape at large by maintaining that habitat. So I want to go to another scope here about answering this question about what to plant and how to go about doing it. And I want to provide a nice example. This is one that I've seen in lettuce in California. So this is just to consider the concept of integration of different materials within field. And this is a really elegant study of Alyssium. It's a white flower and lettuce. And so this was in an organic system. And Eric Brenneman, he did the following. Basically, he started out with how many flowers do we need out there to actually influence pest management in lettuce, so that we can just basically have natural pest management going on and not use insecticides. And so he started out with a system where it was basically one flower planted per lettuce. And you can see here that gets quite dense. So there's certainly a trade-off there. If you have more plant material that is Alyssium instead of lettuce, you're going to get less lettuce. And that, of course, is what they saw. But as he calibrated this, as he went along, by the end of it, it turned out that there's a pretty predictable formula to how many plants per lettuce plant one can use and get that pest management service and not influence production value. So I'm just going to show a few pictures of that, and it looks a little bit something like this. So there's a few Alyssium, what they found, at least in lettuce and vegetable, that you're already doing transplants. So transplanting this little natural pest control plant was beneficial at a pretty low level. In terms of the overall field, what it looked like, it would look something like this. So within the plot, there would be a plant every 20 or so plants, and then each of these are connected, so that along there's always habitat that is connected within the whole production zone. And so over that time, when he was calibrating this, you can see here that we have the amount of Alyssium plants that he kind of started out with needed per acre, down to when it was calibrated to just a few per acre to maintain natural pest control. So that's pretty awesome. And a few stats look like this. So this would be lettuce displaced by Alyssium over the time of playing around with how many to add. First, a whole bunch, so a 17% reduction. That's not going to go over well with our growers. Down to 0% if we add the right amount of floral production in there. You get the pest control services without having to influence production. So here's kind of what the system is looking like now, and hopefully he writes another paper soon so we can check in on this and we can integrate something like this into other systems where it can work. So what to plant and integrate into our systems? Well, it really depends on the goals, and it depends on the system. Some of these plants can grow to be 10 feet tall. Well, that wouldn't work well in many systems. But so deciding on the plant material is key. Plant to maximize season-long bloom. So plants that will continue to bloom are great, or add in plants that a few can bloom at one time, another can bloom another time, another can bloom another time. So they've been talking about plant 3, 3, and 3, so 3 different flowering plants for each season. The success of this will really depend on conditions and compatibility in companion plants. Some of these plants can be aggressive, and so choosing ones that aren't aggressive and ones that grow to maintain appropriate levels. For instance, I'm working with blueberry growers. We don't want plants that are going to compete for light. They need to be low on the ground. We don't want plants that are going to be blooming at the same time that the blueberries are blooming, so that whatever was built up on those blueberry or on the flowers within the blueberry landscape, they build up the pollinator populations and then move on to the blueberry to provide blueberry pollination when it's flowering. Local insect communities can be quite site dependent, so you may not get the same thing in every area. And so some of this will be patience and waiting for these insect communities to redevelop. It does take time. Conservation takes time. So another area that I work in, and that is definitely central to our discussion here, is cover crops. And cover crops have been seen to provide all kinds of different ecosystem services. And the one that has received a bit less is cover crops for actual pest management and what they provide for biodiversity. And so we've been focusing on this one. And this could be quite large. at a very large scale, having more green in the landscape means that the landscape always has habitat there. And so populations that are living out in these landscapes always have somewhere to live, instead of going through periods where the landscape is totally brown or does not have any resources out there to build and maintain those populations. So this is a real active conversation on what kinds of plants to grow, or what kinds of cover crops to use, whether to use mixes. And at the moment, I think this is really a really active area on getting the right plants for the right environments and the right soil and the right desire. And I think that this is going to continue for a while. And I also know from my experience with this is it's not going to be the same fit for every soil, for every type of production, and also for whatever the end goal is for production. So it needs calibration, and but even using the basic formula that I'll provide a few data on, it's good. So what I've been playing with the last little while in cotton is I started out with a few different setups here. One is if we just use a very conventional tillage, so this would be till to maintain weed control and then also use herbivores, or to use winter cover crops, or something that grows throughout the season, being white clover. So the white clover I'm kind of on hold with at the moment because we had some competition for water issues by growing it really within the rows of the cotton. So what I'm going to show you is focused on whether we till and maintain no weed or no weeds in there, or no habitat, or whether we actually have some habitat and residue. And I have quite a bit of data on that over the last few years. So one of the ways that this works is when we build up these areas that we have the cover crops, this will provide resources for things like natural pest managers, being predators, to feed on before the pests are actually there, which should improve diversity and abundance of communities, and therefore those predators can occur within the system to provide pest control. And one of the things that is common about this discussion is, well, if you grow these crops here, well, then that's probably going to boost the populations of some pests, and so therefore it's going to be counter to pest control. And so that's something that we haven't found. And I think the main benefits are that if you use cover crops, commonly that's going to reduce your need to do early season pest management, and we have data to support that as well. So a few things that we found is that this is cover crops. So my 3 different treatments here. This would be no cover. This was tilled during the winter, and then it was also sprayed with herbicides pre-plant. And we have crimson clover and we have rye. Both of these were grown over the winter, and then they were terminated. I think this one was 2 weeks before planting, and I know that there's some calibration on that, but that's what we were using, and it seems more common in here. And what you can see here is during the early season, so I have the x-axis here is the cotton stage. In the early season, if you follow the rye in either one of these years for diversity, in that early part of the season, rye certainly increases the diversity, and so does crimson clover. In the middle of the season, so I'll just highlight that. In the middle of the season, it tends to kind of converge. That is, the diversity that's in the system tends to be about the same between each of those different types of growing, either with a residue or without. And that partially has to do with the change in the system itself. That is, when cotton is growing, the amount of cotton habitat there just exceeds the amount of residue. And so this kind of stabilizes what's in there. And so we can see later in the season, they're about the same. The other thing interesting about this is that these different cover crops, so this is that conventional no cover, this is the crimson clover, and this is the rye. Not only was it diversity, but the function of those communities is different. That is, we have different numbers of different types of things in there. It's not just that we're kind of, we have more of one or the other. It's that we have different communities that would be functionally different within those in that early part of the season. And just to highlight that, so in no cover, number one, we had very few predators within there. And then the diversity of these is highly focused on just things that are running around the surface, being carabids, and we had some spiders. Here, in either of these covers, sure, we have spiders, but we also picked up some geocarids, which are quite important for pest management, and a variety of others in both of these different residue treatments early in the season. So that would be a real positive note for influencing early season pest management, to have more predators in the system. So then what about something of the pest category for thrips? In Georgia, in cotton, we would tend to scout at 14 days post-plant and 21 days post-plant. And here I've shown the data for each of those different treatments then, and then compared them. And if we look at 14 days, there's really no difference. There is some variability. In the nymphs, we actually had an effect for adults, but nymphs are a little more important for showing reproduction. But you can see at day 21, the reproduction on no cover is significantly greater than either one of these different cover cropping treatments, which suggests that by providing cover cropping, we are lowering the thrip pressure within that system to a point where this is not at a level where we need to take action at all. It's taking care of itself. And to show just a little bit more about what might be going on there, we took the predators from each of these different systems, being a no cover, a crimson clover, and a rye. And these bars, the width of this bar up here shows again how many predators were in there relative to those other treatments. We took those predators, we took them out of the field, and we extracted their DNA and then asked the question of that DNA, what types of prey DNA were they feeding on while they were in these different treatments? And one thing that shows up that's kind of interesting here is that they're not really feeding on thrips. So here's the thrips. Here is Columbolus. This is a soil-borne little arthropod, and that helps with nutrient cycling. These are flies. And they're also feeding on aphids, and these are spider mites. So what this suggests then is, even though we got higher numbers of predators, just the direct predation is really not the whole story. Having more predators there would also deter the or change the behavior of the thrips, and also having that cover crop residue there makes it confusing for the thrips to be able to get onto those nice little cotton seedlings and feed. So there's a couple of different mechanisms going on that will explain that that effect of cover crops on thrips, which is good. So later in the season, this one's a little trickier. So later in the season in Georgia, we monitor the presence or need to control southern green stink bug with boll damage. So we go and we collect this one was 40 bolls per plot, and then we calculate the proportion of those bolls that were damaged by stink bugs. And here in 2017, we had very low stink bug pressure, not even a need to spray at all. In 2018, the highest level of damage that we got, which would definitely be need to take action, would be in the no cover crop treatment. So even with that cover crop residue being the only thing, we could reduce damage to the boll just by having that cover crop, because we sprayed no insecticides here. Now the question then is, back to that molecular story I showed you, was, is that related to direct predation on those stink bugs? Well, here again, we have all those predators, the proportion of those predators in each of these treatments. As we saw in the graph previously, they're pretty equivalent at that time across the season. And if you look here, here's my little icon for stink bugs, and here's the level of predation on those stink bugs. So what this suggests is that direct predation on those stink bugs is not enough to explain this reduction, at least from the predators that we collected. There are other predators in the system that we may have missed, and there are also some parasitoids that are out there that we may have missed as well. But this suggests that something else, not related directly to predation, is going on that reduces the stink bug damage to these bolls. So promoting habitat in there in cotton does seem to promote some pest control services, and definitely biodiversity of natural enemies. And so that's one form of habitat that is pretty cheap to integrate and has so many different benefits. One last thing on maintaining a good biodiversity within the system is to definitely scout and practice IPM in there. Reducing pesticides is key. Pesticides are designed to kill things, and in particular for insect management, they're designed to kill insects. They kill insects, and they kill a variety of them. Using insecticides that are specific to the target is key, so that helps as well. And then to only use them and pull that trigger on using that when absolutely needed, because the natural system will be taking care of a considerable amount of that pest management for you. So in closing this down, the two take-homes, as I mentioned earlier, would be that the food and fiber are definitely, production is definitely dependent on biodiversity. We need it, and we need it to operate correctly. Habitat conservation and restoration can help maintain and promote biodiversity within our landscapes, and it's definitely a future goal for sustainability across all of our commodities. I'm going to point to a few resources for the southern folks who are listening. Southern Stare has a lot of information and some other webinars. The NRCS also has information not only on their conservation programs, but actually they have information on how to. And the Xerces Society, it's a nonprofit for biodiversity, they have a lot of nice guides for, asking the question of, when and where do I need to add habitat, and some ideas on going about doing that. They even have checklists so that you can go out and say, okay, I'm looking at take a map image of my land, and I say, okay, how much habitat do I actually have here in proportion to what I'm producing? Okay, what are some areas that then I could enhance the habitat with what I have to work with? So check them out. They've been useful. I give presentations with them regularly, and they're a nice group on conservation. So with that, this is my group again. If you have any questions or would like to contact me, please do so anytime. And thanks a bunch for the opportunity to talk with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Schmidt, for sharing with us today. If anyone has any questions for Dr. Schmidt, you can contact us at info@soilhealth.org with those questions, and we will connect with him on them. And in the next episode, Nathan Lauder will introduce the soil health management practice of cover cropping. So subscribe to our channel and access new episodes from the Healthy Soils for Sustainable Cotton webinar series. Thanks, everyone.